Tonight we're going to talk about Noah and God's covenant with Noah. Sometimes we lose sight of the fact that the world before the flood was a very different place than it is now. And we get a peek into that as we discuss the world before Noah, how sin came into the world and how it developed, and how it differs from the world now, and what the covenant made with Noah, the difference that it made and continues to make today. We'll do that in just a moment. But first, we always want to start with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, as we study your word tonight, we ask that your blessing will be upon it, that your Spirit will lead us as we study, and that we may come to understand the lesson that you have for us. Help us to understand your covenants, what our role is in the covenant keeping, and how to find a way to understand and to please you. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, thanks for joining me this evening. We'll see how it goes. I'm trying very hard to monitor and see the comments as they come in. I see that Sandy B is here joining us, and I appreciate that. Anyway, going to move forward with the lesson. The memory text is a wonderful one. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. This is Genesis 6:8. Now, Genesis 6:8 is before the start of the flood. It's the beginning of the flood story. But the flood itself begins to take place a couple of chapters, a chapter later. And so this is the preparation, as it were, to the flood. And we're going to spend a good deal of time on understanding the conditions that led to the flood in the first place. And here we go, Genesis 6:5. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart were only evil all the time. That is an amazingly sweeping statement. Only evil all the time. And that was every inclination. So this is describing a culture in which only bad things are being thought about, only bad things are being contemplated and being implemented then on a continuous basis. Oh, well. Looks like someone shared us. Thank you very much. More people joining. Thank you. This is a devastating statement. And what you have here is that what precedes the flood of water is the flood of sin. But how did we get to this point? We started with a totally perfect planet, a totally perfect environment, and two perfect people. And yet, in a relatively short space, we get to this position where, again, every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. This is just such a strong repetition. And so let's take a look. Well, the first thing, and the lesson calls us the sin principle, and it's important to understand that the sin principle is, in fact, a principle, and that there is a progression of things that has taken place here. Well, thank you. Been shared again. This is very helpful to me. Thank you very much. The first part is that the woman took some of the fruit and ate it, and that's an action on her part. This is the very first, there's a very small thing, but it's the beginning of the progression of evil. Evil progresses steadily through the early chapters. And just a few verses later, when God has said, well, where are you? And not that he doesn't know, but Adam doesn't really realize where he is. It says we hid because we were naked. And God says, who told you were naked? Have you eaten the fruit you weren't supposed to? And the man said it was the woman. She gave it to me. And the woman says, what was the serpent? And they were both blaming God, because God had given Adam the woman, and he'd given the serpent in the garden. So you see this progression of sin. Now there's blaming each other. There's no longer unity between the two. And that's, it's a terrible thing to have happened. Then in chapter 4 already, chapter 3 is where the fall takes place. 1 and 2 simply describe the establishment of the world and the establishment of God as the ruler and as the one who created everything, and then Adam as the ruler of this world, especially the garden. That's where he's put in charge of all that. Well, so 1 and 2 are just that. Chapter 3 is where the fall takes place. And in chapter 4, we have Cain and Abel. And they both bring a sacrifice, and Cain's sacrifice is not accepted. And Cain was very angry. This is an attitude. It's the first time that anger is mentioned. It's the first time we know of anger. And only a few verses later, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. So we've gone from a very short time from simply distrusting God and trusting what the serpent said to murder and fratricide at that, brother killing brother. This will be a portent of the way human race will relate to one another. Brother will kill brother for millennia after this. Cain, so there's another action, and we see these actions are accelerating. They are escalating. Then we get to verse 19 of chapter 4, not very much further. In fact, it's the next notable person in the line of Cain is Lamech. And it says that he married 2 women. It was always God's plan that there was one man, one woman was one flesh. But Lamech married 2 women. It's the first time we know polygamy. And it's fascinating to me because sociologists tell us that there is a definite link between polygamy and violence in a society. And there are many reasons for this, but the very simple one is that if young men if women are scarce, that is to say, a few men take up all of the women, then the remaining young men, in order to gain access, try to do something that is demonstrably virile in their eyes, or demonstrably male, aggressive, and that means violence. There's a lot of violence over this. And it's something we should be taking a real good look at today, because I believe there's something like 20 million more men in China than there are women of marriageable age because of one-child policy that was there for so long. China has a lot of restless young men, and that usually means trouble for neighbors. Any society that has lots of unmarriageable young men. Lamech married 2 women, and he's going to say, I have killed a man for wounding. So now we have murder taking place on a regular basis, and he says that he's if Cain is avenged 7 times, he says, well, I'll be avenged 77 times. So he is much more violent. He is going to avenge himself more than God was going to avenge Cain. And so Lamech is claiming to be better than God. He gave himself 2 wives. He kills 77 times. And then we find this culmination then in chapter 6, verse 5, where God sees that there's only evil continually. And it also says that the earth is filled with violence. Well, the earth is filled with violence because people like Lamech are going to rule. If you have violence and you have murder and it is unpunished, which is what was established when Cain was not punished for Abel's murder. In other words, people took it into their own hands. Then the person who is most likely and most willing to be violent is the person who's going to rule. He's going to kill a lot of other people. And yes, I said he, because as has been established by a lot of things, that there isn't a great deal of difference between the aggression of males and females, but they're bell-shaped curves. And at the extremes, if you take the average man and the average woman, the average man is more likely to be violent than the average woman. But there are women who are more violent than the average man. But what you find is if you take 1 out of 100, you end up with the extreme end of the male end of the bell curve. And so people that are in jail tend to be male. They're violent. There's there's violence inherent in the sinful nature, and with males with their testosterone and aggression, it isn't what people call toxic masculinity. It's simply that the tail end of the bell curve, the most aggressive people are going to be male. And there you are. You have this progression. It starts out with something very simple and very small, and apparently not that deal. But it is distrust. It is signing on, if you will, to a different program. It's moving from trusting in God and what he says to trusting what the serpent says. And this has these dire consequences. But there's a text missing. These are texts that are listed in our lesson, but there's a text missing, which I think is key to this whole thing, and it is not mentioned in the lesson, but it's definitely there in Genesis and in this progression of events. And it is, for me, one of the 5 or 6 texts in the Bible that are absolutely chilling. They send the hair on the back of my neck up because it's just so frightening and so overwhelmingly. So there's that gap, and it's right between where Cain is angry and where he attacked his brother Abel and killed him. 4:5 is Cain is angry. 4:8 is where he kills his brother. But 4:6, this is when God sees that because Cain's sacrifice was not accepted. It says Cain was very angry and he was downcast. His face was downcast. So you can see this anger, and he's dwelling on it. He's very angry. And God gives Cain a warning. So far, yes, we're all sinners and Cain has sinned, but so far he's not killed his brother. That's going to take a little bit later before that happens. And God gives Cain a warning to protect him and to protect Abel, obviously, but protect the world from the first murder. And here's what he says. It's a fascinating thing. Sin is crouching at your door. Literally, it's crouching at your tent flap. It desires to have you. And the word for desire means to yearn, to hunger. What has happened here is that something significant has changed. And we'll see how that works. Because first of all the other actions and attitudes in this list are actions and attitudes of human beings. But here it is, sin is crouching. Sin desires. These are, acts of the will. They're actions and attitudes. Sin is yearning. It's hungering after. Of course, sin is essentially then personifying Lucifer, the devil, the serpent. And that is what has changed here. It's it's an amazing thing. I never saw it till I studied the lesson this time, but it's such a pivotal text and such a chilling one. Sin is crouching at the door. It's waiting. It reminds me, my aunt and uncle, my uncle recently passed away, but they have a dairy ranch in Texas, some distance from Houston. And on their property, they have killed all 4 kinds of poisonous snakes that are available in the United States. I say 4 kinds. There are numerous species of rattlesnakes, for example. They killed a rattlesnake and a copperhead and a cottonmouth and a coral snake. They killed those are the 4 basic types of snakes, the poisonous snakes in the United States. And they'd killed them all within 100 feet of their door. And one morning when they woke up, the dog was barking at their steps. So they had a set of wooden steps. It's a warm climate. And they had a set of steps to their front door, and the steps were open. And the dog was barking at the steps. Well, since they lived with all these snakes around on a constant basis, they figured out what to do. And my uncle went out the back door, went around the front of the house, and sure enough, there was a rattlesnake under the steps. And of course, it was, if you want, it was coiled at the door. And had they stepped out right between in the open space between the steps, they probably would have been bitten by the rattlesnake. This always comes to my mind when I read this text, because it's so, you don't think about it. And if if it had been someone who was, shall we say, unaccustomed and then didn't think about it, they could have been bitten and badly hurt. So something has taken place here, because there's a difference between what happens here and what happened in the garden. And that's what I want to look at, because the action and the attitude is that of sin, or if you will, since actions and attitudes are taken by persons, it's by Lucifer. In Genesis 3, the serpent is encountered at the tree of knowledge of good and evil. In fact, that's the only place they can't go in the garden. It tells us that the serpent is essentially restrained. He is limited to that location. He can't roam the garden freely. Otherwise, they would have been warned about the serpent, not about the tree. Don't go to the tree. That's where the serpent is. All right. So what happens then is he's restricted. He can't just go everywhere. He's there. He has the opportunity. Go into the great controversy and why God allows this, but Lucifer, the serpent, who is acting as his surrogate, is present there and has the opportunity to present his side, his lies, his side of the story. But he can't just wander through the garden. He's restricted to the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Exactly how big that is, I don't know. Whether there's a circumference at the base or whatever. That's not the point. He's restricted to that area, very small area. He's restricted. He can't get out, can't go after them. In fact, if they're going to be tempted, humans have to go to him. They've been told not to. And so that's an act of distrusting God to begin with. But humans have to go there to be tempted. If they stay away from that area, there are no temptations. There are no dangers for them in the garden. He's restricted to the tree. But in Genesis 4, nobody's in the garden anymore. The garden, the Adam and the Eve have been cast out. Obviously, their children can't go there. There's an angel with a flaming sword keeping them out. So nobody's in the garden, but here the sin, and again, sin it has to be, because it's personified, it crouches and yearns, it's hungering after him. It has to be an entity. And so it's the serpent or one of his minions, certainly. In Genesis 4, sin crouches and yearns. These are the actions of an entity. What has happened is that the serpent, Lucifer, who is confined to a small area within the garden at the one tree, because of the actions of our first parents, has been set free. He's not in the garden anymore, but neither are they. And so now, it isn't so much that before they had to go to him, but now he can seek out, he can lay wait, he can prey upon unsuspecting humans. I say unsuspecting. He's crouching at the door, the tent flap. He's waiting to spring. There's this sense of the predator waiting to spring. And that's what's happened. What's happened in between Genesis 3 and 4 is that sin has been set loose. Lucifer, the devil and his minions, have been set loose on this earth. And they are always lying in wait for the unwary. Unfortunately, that includes me. Sometimes they get me. We are all sinners. It's just the way it is. So sin has become activated, it's been released. It's like the virus getting out of the lab. Take whatever metaphor you want. Suddenly, what was confined and strained and restricted has been set loose to wreak havoc on everyone, everything. So there it is. They said, and that's what happens. So, and this is the same experience that the Apostle Paul mentions in Romans, because you have now these two different things. The Spirit of God is striving within us, but the spirit of the adversary is also waiting, lying in wait to spring out upon us. And here it says, "For I joyfully agree with the law of God in the inner person, but I see a different law in the parts of my body, waging war against the law of my mind, and making me a prisoner of the law of sin, the law which is in my body's parts." So what he says is we are, each of us, a battlefield of the great controversy. Each of us is where this battle is taking place between good and evil. That's only because it's only possible because Christ died for us. Because Christ was the lamb slain from the foundation of the world. If that had not been true, then we would simply be the prey of the evil one. There's a happy thought. But it is a happy thought. It shows us that God was planning for giving grace, even though he knew we would fail, long before sin entered the world. And there you see it. And there's this parallelism. I agree with the law of God in the inner person, the mind, the thinking part, but I see a different law in the parts of my body, waging war against the law of my mind, making me the prisoner of the law of sin, which is in my body. It says the mind against the body. Mind is matter, I suppose. But of course, the problem is even deeper than that, because it's our mind is also the battleground where we don't even know many times how we're sinning. We're not even aware of the temptations to which we yield, or which we aren't even subject to, because we just go ahead and sin anyway. We've been at it a while. All right. So here comes into this scene of incredible evil. Evil has been set loose. Evil has been running riot. Evil has been predatory. It has been preying upon humanity. It's hungering after us. And as a result, you get the Lamechs of the world who are boasting about their evil. They're boasting about about violence. They're ruling the world, and the world then has become this place of unmitigated evil. It just goes on all the night. All the imaginings of their hearts are only evil continually, and that's the setting. All this evil. The earth is filled with violence. And it says also that there's so much violence that God says, I'm sorry I even made man. It's just a terrible, it's a frightful thing. Now, it doesn't mean that God repented in the sense that we do, but simply that he was sorrowed by, he experienced sorrow at seeing what happened. And into this we have Noah. And Noah, I'm not sure why it's doing that. Hang on a minute, we'll find out what's going on here. I see what's happened. I apologize for this. All right. Sometimes things just don't behave the way you expect them to. Right now, several things aren't behaving the way I want them to. All right. Hmm. All right. I think finally have things where I want them. Noah was a righteous man. So he stands out in this generation. He stands out as, um, in this violent generation. He's not violent, apparently, but because we're told he's a righteous man, calls on the name of the Lord. He's blameless. He hasn't done, he doesn't do he doesn't do evil. And he's walking with God. And this makes him very unusual. In fact, as we shall see, it makes him unique in the pre-flood world. It's become totally dominated by violent human beings. That's what we said was going to happen. If you don't punish murder, then murder those who are willing to murder are set free. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Noah was not perfect. He was righteous. He was blameless in that sense. He walked with God, but he still needed grace. And Noah, this is what favor, it's the same word. Charis is gift in Greek, but it's defined as unmerited favor. It's a gift. Noah is given the gift of God's favor because the world is so full of violence, and only Noah is walking apparently with God. I say only. If you do the genealogies, Methuselah died the year the flood started. So Methuselah was probably one of the last good guys, and he died. And you had Noah and his sons, and that was it. And as we find out later, his sons weren't any great bargain either. Nor was Noah. He was drunk afterwards, but that's not for now. That's after the flood. The world before the flood is this violent place, ruled by the most vile people, the ones who are most willing to be the most violent. And God says, I'm going to destroy this. He said, I can't take it. There's just too much evil, too much sin. Now, I believe that the whole purpose of the antediluvian, the flood world, or at least I shouldn't say the whole purpose, but one of the major purposes is that we have to, what was lost at the garden was the trust of God. People didn't trust God's ways. They trusted the serpent. And so what has to happen for God to reestablish trust, because trust cannot be forced. In fact, the more you try to force it, the more difficult it becomes to trust. You become suspicious. Why am I being pushed? We don't, any of us like that. So what happens here is that God has to reestablish trust. And so the first thing is that Cain is following the serpent's way. And, Cain says, well, I'm going to, everybody's going to kill me. And God says, no, I'll keep you alive. Because he's not going to punish murder, because God has to let us understand, has to let us, and as we see later in Job, the sons of God, whoever they are, whether they're angels or beings from other places, we don't know. But we know that they're undecided early on. And for those who are interested in that, you can leave a comment. I can do I can put up a Job video, because Job is a fascinating situation. But it isn't decided yet. There's a controversy. God says one thing, Lucifer says another, and the question is, who is right? How do we know who's right? And so God says, you have it your way. And for however long it is, how many centuries, they have it their way. And what you find is a world that's full of violence. It doesn't establish a good place to live. It doesn't establish a society that doesn't people better. It makes them far, far worse. So that God simply allows that, but he's got to, and once we understand, once it is demonstrated by the behavior of those who are following Lucifer, that just isn't going to work. It isn't going to get better. Once that is established, then God says, okay, this didn't work. It's not that he was in any doubt about it, but you finally see this is not going to get better. And so what he does is he tries to wipe the slate clean. Now, again, what he does is he kills sinners, but not sin. Because Noah still has sin, and his sons do too, which we see right after the flood. But we're not quite there yet. And we are all sinners. Noah was a sinner. He found grace. He found favor in the eyes of the Lord, because God says, I'm going to destroy the entire world. He's going to save Noah and his family. And through him, through Noah, he is going to save the entire world. And I mean all the animal life, for example. So he's saving everyone through that. I mean, that means everything that can be saved. A few exceptions, we'll look at that. But with thee, now, I don't know, the King James is being used in this lesson. But with thee will I establish my covenant, and thou shalt come into the ark, thou and thy sons and thy wife and thy sons' wives with thee. He says, everybody else is going to be destroyed. Anyone who's not in the ark is going to, I'm making this covenant with you. Now, anyone who accepted Noah's protection could have entered the ark. That's not the issue. But the issue is who trusts God. It had never rained until that point. Mist came up from the ground, and if you've ever been in a cloud forest, for example, you know that can be a very effective way of watering the earth. The cloud forest in Mexico, for example, is just gorgeous. But so it never rained, and God says you need a boat, and he's nowhere near water. And so that takes trust, that takes faith, that you have to trust the one who says to do this. I'll make this covenant with you, and you will be saved, but you have to come into the ark. And that means you have to build the ark too. But I'll tell you how. So Noah finds favor with God in that God says, I will save you, but you have to demonstrate your faith. It is not, the ark does not save Noah. It is not such a seaworthy vessel that it would save him. Imagine the flood that's so vast that it swept over the entire earth. It would be a very violent thing. It was God's protection over the ark, God's hand over the ark, that saved Noah. But Noah needs to demonstrate. It's a public testimony of his faith to build the ark and to enter the ark. And this is the same thing that's asked of us. It isn't a righteous act when we are baptized. It isn't a righteous act when we come to Christ. But it is counted as righteousness. It is a public demonstration that we have chosen to avoid the tree of knowledge of good and evil, to avoid the ways of the serpent, and to adopt the ways of God. Again, it doesn't give us any merit. It doesn't give us any credit anywhere. But it does tell the world, and perhaps those sons of God that were in Job, I'm a free moral agent, and I choose this. And it's not easy. It's going to be easy for Noah. So, that's what happens here. I'll establish the covenant, but you have to do these things. And then after the flood, when they've been saved, you have the sign of the rainbow, and God said, this is the sign of the covenant which I have between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Now it says between me and you and every living creature that is with you. Between me and the earth. There's your parallel expression. But you see, the earth is saved through Noah. Noah is the steward of all of these things. He is the vice regent. He is the ruler in charge that God put. He's ruling in God for God's purposes. And so that's what happens. He makes this covenant with the earth through Noah. Noah is the protector of the earth. And so God, when he makes the covenant with Noah, is also making it with the earth. And that's expressed in this parallelism here. This is the sign, of course, it's the rainbow. And every time thereafter, I've mentioned this before because it's such a fascinating thing to me personally, and that is every time after this text in 9:12-13, whenever the throne of God is pictured, there's a rainbow over it or around it. There's a rainbow because God is the one who remembers and keeps the covenants. You can't remember anything else from this whole 13 weeks when we're finally done studying. This is the third lesson, but when we get done with all 13 lessons, you can't remember anything else about the covenants. Remember that God is the covenant keeper. As we saw last week, and we will see repeatedly, we keep breaking the covenant. We enter in with the best of intentions, and we claim that we will do it as we're told, but we do not have the power to do it unless he gives it to us. And then effectively, he is keeping the covenant through us. But as we shall see, ultimately, he kept the covenant for us in order that we might be able to continue to keep the covenant. He might be his sons and daughters. He can keep the covenant through us as well. Those things are inextricably linked one to the other. All right, so there it is. Every living creature, this and with the earth, because of the rainbow, is that sign. Now that was afterwards. Here's what happens during the flood. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground. Man and animals and creeping things and birds of the air. What's not listed here? Something isn't listed here. I'm watching, see if there are any comments. Something isn't listed here. And what might it be that is not being listed? Well, to make it very simple, it's the animals that live in the sea, because of course the flood is just an extension of the sea. Now, I'm not saying that none of the animals in the sea died. Probably many did, because of all of the mudslides and all the earth moved and probably buried some of there's a lot of things that happened under the surface of the sea that killed some of the sea creatures. But it's saying here these are the man and animals and creeping things and birds of the air, but there's no mention of fish. Everything that was upon the face of the ground was blotted out. Now you may say, well, why weren't the other things? Well, there's a couple of reasons for this. Obviously, one is just simply the whole issue of the flood itself, the fact that it's water, and although it may have been hazardous and killed many, it wasn't the kind of catastrophic event underwater that would have been. But there's something else here going on, and that is the water is always seen as the chaos element. It is the chaotic element in creation. The earth was without form and void. It was covered with water, because water, again, you don't have to live in the ocean. We used to live near Lake Michigan, and if you stand near the lake on a stormy day, you see some mighty big waves that come in. It's not surprising that ancient man looked at the sea and just thought this is chaos. All kinds of things are going on, and they're totally uncontrollable. And if you go out in a boat, you find out they control you, not you control them. And that same thing is happening here. The animals that live in the water are viewed as perhaps minions of the evil one, to some degree. Certainly, Behemoth and Leviathan, which are the sea serpents, their water sea monsters, if you will. in the Old Testament time, in the ancient thought, were manifestations of chaos and of evil power. So everything that's living is what happens is Adam represents the ordered realm. Noah represents the ordered realm, the garden where it's tended, it's kept, and where the animals are cared for. But of course, now that sin is there, it's not so orderly as all that. But because man has sinned so badly, then man and especially the animals for which he's most responsible, those that dwell on the ground where man dwells, they are blotted out. Only Noah was left, and those that were with him in the ark. And this would mean, of course, his sons and his daughters-in-law, but it also means all the creatures that were with him. You see, the earth is going to be the ground that was obliterated. All the life everything that was on the face of that ground was obliterated, except for what was with Noah. And so that's what's going to happen, is that Noah is going to reestablish this. He carries the seed, he carries the egg, the basic unit through which the earth itself will be replenished. God blotted out. And you notice that this statement, very typically of ancient statements, not only is a repetition, but this is chiastic. That is to say, the first and the last. He blotted out, they were blotted out. The first and the last statements are the same match, and the middle statements match too. Every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the air. So those are the mirroring elements. And it's just telling you that everything on the earth was destroyed. I want to emphasize that. The earth, which is where humankind lived, and which is where the violence was most manifested, because that's where the humans were. The earth is the place that has to be cleansed. It has to be wiped clean. And that's what this little chiasm is pointing out. So it's man's influence. It's humanity's influence, the sinful progression, sin as a principle, not as an action. That's where we saw that sin becomes this active thing that seeks us out and lays ambushes for us. So that's what only Noah was left, and it's through him God wants to reestablish the earth. Now, we've talked about this every week. We want to continue to make it clear. Covenant components, covenant promises, covenant obligation, and covenant fulfillment. We mentioned this last week among many of the covenants that were covered, but so you see it again specifically. The covenant promise, deliverance from the flood. I will save. I make my covenant with you. Okay. I'm making this covenant with you, but you have to come into the ark. And that's the obligation. You will enter the ark. If he doesn't enter the ark, nothing happens. Again, it's not salvation by works. It is a demonstration that he's already found grace in the eyes of the Lord. God has given him the plans to build the ark, and God tells him when to go into the ark. And because God's hand is over the ark, Noah and those with him will be saved. It was grace. And of course, the great flood chiasm we've done many times here, 8:1, God remembers Noah. That's the only reason he survives the flood. God remembers Noah. But the obligation is you will enter the ark. You will demonstrate your faith. Again, it's not works. It's not an achievement on the part of Noah. It's not any merit of his that he's in the ark, because the ark won't save him, and he didn't even plan that. He was given the plans for the ark from God himself. But that's his obligation, is to demonstrate his faith, to demonstrate that he trusts God. And the covenant fulfillment then is very simple. God remembered Noah. Chapter 8:1. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Noah found favor. However you want to express that, that's the covenant. And this is the great thing about covenants, is that when God sets up a covenant with humankind, he also, when he sets up the obligations, He provides the means by which we can keep it. If he didn't, we never would. We couldn't. So it's we can say that we have our part to play, and we do, which is to demonstrate our faith. But that's all our part is to demonstrate our faith. Having said that's all it is, doesn't mean it's a small thing. It just simply means that it is not an achievement as we like to think of such things. Well, that is the covenant with Noah. And I hope that you take away several things from this. One is that that evil was constrained in the garden. It was limited only to the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That once humankind chose to trust the serpent, who was only available, they had to go to him. Remember, he couldn't go to them. They had to go to him. Once they heeded the serpent, however, they gave him the key and let him out. And sin went from being something which was waiting for us to seek it to something that was always hungering after our souls, hungering after our persons, and was laying ambushes and lying in wait and continually yearning to subject us to the power of Lucifer. So that's one thing that's important to understand, that we set this loose. And that when we set it loose, God says, okay, I have to let it run for a while so that you understand why I said what I did in the first place. Trust has to be earned in God. It's no less true for God, infinite though he is, if he wants free beings with free will to trust him, then he has to persuade them, not coerce them. And coercion, by the way, is always a tool of the devil. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to understand that when God makes covenants with human beings, that it is not because we have earned it, but because he has shown us favor. And finally, that the only way these covenants can be kept by human beings, especially in a world where sin lies in wait to ambush us at every turn, where we become insensitive, desensitized to sin because of centuries of sinning. The only way it can be kept is because of the grace of God. Noah found grace. Noah found favor. And that was the fulfilling of the covenant. Noah himself is far from perfect. He will build a vineyard. He will get drunk. He will repeat the sin of Adam. Adam was sinned in the garden with the fruit of the tree. Noah sins in a vineyard with the fruit of the vine. Both are shamefully naked, and both of them the curse falls upon their seed and so forth. There's many more similarities. So Noah's going to recapitulate, unfortunately, some of the sorry parts of the earlier history. But what's changed is that there is the memory now of what happens in a world in which violence is not punished. Should be a cautionary tale for us today, because we seem to be forgetting what happens in a world where violence is not punished. But anyway, I hope this has been useful for you. I hope it has given you some new grounds for belief, a stronger sense of understanding God's grace in your life, and recognizing that it is only by grace that we are able to even recognize what these covenants are. These covenants are always commitments made by God with people who are unreliable, and yet he allows us and gives us grace to become more reliable. And that as we become more reliable, it is to his glory and not ours. Well, I hope that's useful to you. I hope to see you again. I hope that you've enjoyed this lesson. If you would like to support this ministry, you can contact me at BibleJourneys@yahoo.com. You can also, if you have questions or comments concerning what's been presented here, be glad to respond to those. And if you'd like to support the ministry, there are several opportunities at my Patreon page, www.patreon.com/BibleJourneys. And until next week, then, I hope when Lord willing, we'll embark on another Bible journey, another study of Old Testament covenants, and covenants, period, and understanding the grace of God, the God who will condescend to make a covenant with sinful humans. Well, Lord bless you this week. Until we meet again.